This is the first part of Lesson 2-4, Solving Equations with Variables on Both Sides. The learning target, to solve equations with variables on both sides. Now we will solve an equation with variables on both sides. Our goal is to get all of the variables to one side and all of the constants to the other. I will begin by subtracting 2x from both sides, making sure that I line up the like terms. So I will do 2x minus 2x and 5x minus 2x. This will ensure that one side of the equation will have the variable x and one side of the equation will not. Subtracting the same number on both sides is the subtraction property of equality. Now we will actually do the subtraction, and we will get 3x plus 2 equals 14. So we use subtraction to simplify. Now we need to get the 3x by itself, so we will subtract 2 from both sides. Once again, we use the subtraction property of equality. Now we will simplify 3x equals 12. We use subtraction to simplify. Now we want to isolate the variable x. Since 3x is being multiplied, we will now divide both sides by 3. Since we divided both sides by 3, we use the division property of equality. 3x divided by 3 is going to be just x. 12 divided by 3 is going to be 4. We used division to simplify. Now I want to check my answer to make sure that I did it correctly. So I'm going to plug in 4, so I have 5 times 4 plus 2 equals 2 times 4 plus 14. 5 times 4 is 20. 2 times 4 is 8. 20 plus 2 is 22. And 8 plus 14 is 22. So both sides equal 22, so I know my answer is correct. As I told you in class, you do not have to show the check, but you must still check it, whether you use a calculator or you just show it on your paper. You must still check it to ensure that you have the correct answer. Using an equation with variables on both sides. The first thing I want to point out is that since this is a word problem, we're going to have to write the equation. We're going to list everything we know, we're going to define the variable, and we're going to write an equation. But I want to point out to you the title here says using an equation with variables on both sides. So when you write the equation, you should have variables on both sides. So let's begin by listing the information that we're given. The first sentence tells us that it takes a graphic designer 1.5 hours to make one page of a website. So that's the first piece of information that we're going to list. The next sentence says using new software, the designer could complete each page in 1.25 hours, but it takes 8 hours to learn the software. So I listed that information to be the next two pieces of information. How many web pages would the designer have to make in order to save time using the new software? That is the last piece of information, and that is the missing information. Our next step is to define the variable. So we take the missing information, how many pages needed in order to save time, and we're going to make the variable display that information. I defined P to equal the number of pages needed. Now we have to begin setting up our equation. Remember, there's variables on both sides, so we're going to need to make sure that our equation has variables on both sides. So let's think about the problem. Right now it takes 1.5 hours for one page. But with the software, it would be 1.25 hours for one page, but you also have 8 hours of learning the software. If P is the number of pages needed, we can simply start the left side of the equation by writing 1.5 times P, because it's going to take 1.5 hours for every page if you don't buy the software. Now we want to know when will that be equal to using the software, which would be 1.25 hours for every page plus 8 hours to learn the software. We want to know when they equal each other because we're looking to see how many pages needed in order to save time. So if these two equations equal each other, then that would mean the same number of pages are required and it would take the same amount of time. So let's go to solve this equation. First of all, I want to make sure my variables are both on the same side. So I'm going to subtract 1.25p from both sides of the equation. I chose that one because if I brought 1.5p over to the other side by subtracting that on both sides, we would end up with 0 on the left side of the equal sign, and we still wouldn't have the variable all alone. So we bring down the 8, and 1.5 minus 1.25 is 0.25p. We divide both sides by 0.25, and we get p equals 32. Now let's think about the problem and think about what we're being asked. We're asked how many pages the designer would have to make in order to save time using the new software. Well, we just found out that 32 pages would be when it would take the same amount of time. So that means our final answer would actually be 33 pages. 33 pages to save time. Okay, again, because 32 would be the exact same amount of time. We set them equal to each other. So we found out that if they created 32 pages, they would finish at the same time, whether they used the software or did it by themselves. However, the 33rd page is where they begin to save time. Solving an equation with grouping symbols. This problem requires us to use the distributive property on both sides of the equal sign. So 2 times 5x is 10x. 2 times -1 is -2. 3 times x is 3x. And 3 times 11 is 33. As I stated in the beginning, that step was used because of the distributive property. Next, we want to work towards getting all the variables on one side and all the constants on the other. So I will subtract 3x from both sides so that we no longer have the variable x on the right side of the equation. And that was the subtraction property of equality. So 10x minus 3x is going to give us 7x minus 2 equals 33. And we use subtraction to simplify that. All right, the next step is working towards isolating that variable. We want to get 7x by itself. So we're going to add 2 to both sides, which is the addition property of equality. So we have 7x equals 35. We used addition to simplify. Now we have to get the x alone, and since 7x is actually multiplication, we're going to divide by 7. And that's using the division property of equality. 7x divided by 7 will just give us x. 35 divided by 7 gives us 5. And we use division to simplify and get our final answer. Steps for solving multi-step equations. These steps will help you determine what to do first and the order in which you need to do things when you're solving these equations that have many steps in them. Step 1, we always use the distributive property to remove any grouping symbols. Use properties of equality to clear decimals or fractions. Now, using the distributive property is anytime you see those grouping symbols with a number outside that has to be multiplied in, you do that first. Using the properties of equality to clear decimals and fractions is what we learned in class yesterday, and that is optional if you choose to remove the decimals or fractions. That is done right after you do the distributive property. Step 2, you combine like terms on each side of the equation. So we're talking about like terms that are on the same side of the equal sign, if there are any. Step 3, use properties of equality to get the variable terms on one side of the equation and the constants on the other. So that's where you'll add on both sides or subtract on both sides to make sure the variables are on one side and the constants are on the other. Step 4, use the properties of equality to solve for the variable. So whether you're dividing both sides or multiplying both sides, or adding or subtracting, you're using those properties to solve for the variable. And step 5, of course, is to check your solution in the original equation. Now it's your turn. Solve each equation, justify each step. You do not have to justify the steps for number 2, the word problems, but you must for number 1 and 3, using all of the properties that you know so far. Have a great night, and see you tomorrow.